Welcome everybody to the Thoughtful Bro live streaming on a mighty blaze. I am so excited to bring you our guest this week. It's going to be an amazing discussion full of little nested surprises. Just wait, there's all kinds of treats sprinkled through this interview that's about to come. Like every week, we're here at 2 o'clock on Tuesday on a Thoughtful Bro. We're here to talk about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. For those who don't know about what a mighty blaze is, we are an initiative that started last spring. We're a collective of authors and publishing industry folks who are basically just here to help connect writers with readers in a time when most book tours are no longer happening. We've had amazing interviews. You can check out our library. Recent interviews include Erica Jong, Dean Koontz, Judy Bloom, John Irving, Edwidge Dandicat, Phil Cly, Sigrid Nunez, and many, many more. We do about a half dozen new interviews every week, usually with somebody who's just released a book. If you want to help us or support us, we're not asking for anything other than that you smash that like button on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. We're an all-volunteer organization, as I said, so just your eyeballs is all we ask for. If you have any questions for today, as usual, just pop them in the chat on Facebook and they will make their way to me and I will ask Johnathan whatever you guys come up with. We'll leave probably about 5-10 minutes for that at the end. And then just one last thing before we get going is next week we have Eric Weiner who's going to be on the show. Eric wrote this book called The Socrates Express. Eric has like a very kind of interesting approach to nonfiction where he takes kind of big, grand, scientific, philosophical, intellectual ideas and then just translates them for the layperson. So the Socrates Express is just going to be basically about how you can not read Plato, but still have Socrates be a benefit in your daily life. So that's next week. We'll see you guys on that one. And now on to this week. I am so thrilled to have Johnathan Lethem joining us. Johnathan is a novelist, essayist, and short story writer. He's the author of 12 novels. His 1999 novel, Motherless Brooklyn, won the National Book Critics Circle Award, and last year it became a major Hollywood motion picture starring Ed Norton. In 2005, he became a MacArthur Fellow. Since 2011, he has taught creative writing at Pomona College as the Roy E. Disney Professor of Creative Writing, a position formerly held by none other than David Foster Wallace. Jonathan's new book, The Arrest, is about two former Hollywood filmmakers who now have to live through a kind of agrarian, screen-free, gentle apocalypse. The New York Times called The Arrest an inventive, entertaining, and superbly written book, and went on to say that Lethem is a master at subverting expectations of form and genre, and is the author of some of the most original novels in the last several decades. Johnathan, welcome to the Thoughtful Bro.
Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. All right, folks. So we're going to talk about The Arrest, and then we're going to talk a little bit about craft, because Johnathan, if you've never seen an interview with Johnathan, it's unlikely because he does a lot of interviews, but it's just everything Johnathan says ends up being really interesting about either his books or about the craft of writing. And also, I have some very special questions at the end of the interview because Johnathan likes to joke that like he's been asked every question on the face of the earth. So I did some digging, including into an old Bob Dylan interview that he did. And we have some very good questions that we're going to ask him at the end. And we're going to show you the first book Johnathan Lethem ever loved that made him fall in love with books. We're going to actually show you that book. So stick around. But Johnathan, I just moments ago characterized The Arrest. Why don't you, in your own words, just tell us what the book is about?
Sure, yeah, well, so it's set in Maine, in a coastal town that is fictional, but kind of analogous to places I spend time and I really love. Rural villages that are dominated by a history of farming, and in the case of this peninsula that I love and that I've sort of fictionalized lightly in this book, with a past of being a quarrying place where there was granite. And actually, there's a little island right near this town where the granite for the Brooklyn Bridge was carved out of this hole in the ground and ferried down the Atlantic coast to become the foundation stones for the Brooklyn Bridge. And so in this story set in coastal Maine, which is in an unspecified, very near future, there is a very unspecified, vague, not even apocalypse really, it's a collapse. It's just a kind of gentle societal falling down into a ditch and not getting up. The machines many of the machines stop working. Gas engines don't work, guns don't work. Crucially for people like you and I and our audience, screens, phones, televisions, the internet, that all goes away. And together with all the things that by implication disappear. There are no streaming services, there are no airplanes. There's not only no international communication, it's really hard to know what's going on even in the next town over. So everything's been reduced to this kind of supremely local condition. And now a lot of people, the first thing they say when they hear this is that's not necessarily a dystopia or a post-apocalypse, that's maybe a wish fulfillment. Maybe you're actually, kind of yearning to live in a space like this. And I will be the first to say that question of why we write stories about catastrophes often in order to create a vision of the world that we're actually going to find a little more agreeable than the one we live in, that's foremost in my mind in this book. I grew up reading, I guess you'd call them pastoral apocalypse books, from Earth Abides by George R. Stewart to Dr. Blood Money by Philip K. Dick, and Always Coming Home by Ursula Le Guin. And these are basically, they use some kind of catastrophe or apocalypse as the portal into a reset, a chance to make an anarchist utopia, a gentler, more centered kind of existence for the characters. And I wanted to fool around with that tradition and think about it in this book. So that's one of the main things I'm doing. But I also, I grew up as a painter's kid and an aspiring writer and filmmaker. I was a city kid. I wasn't good with my hands necessarily. I didn't practice, woodcraft or farming or metallurgy or, and at the same time, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and the apocalyptic imagination was very strong. I read these kinds of books that I'm describing to you, and I looked at movies like Demolition Alley and A Boy and His Dog, and I watched the Twilight Zone episodes on rerun television, and even just listening to a song like Bob Dylan's "Hard Rain's Gonna Fall," I felt and in school I'm old enough that I actually practiced like bomb shelter drills. I remember duck and cover drills when I was very young. So the fantasy, and I think this is a very generic one that came to mind for me, is what will I do in the new world that's inevitably coming when World War III happens? Oh, I'll be the storyteller. They'll need me by the fire, keeping the legends of society alive. I'll be the myth maker, and they'll esteem me a great status and take very good care of me because I'll be this precious commodity, the storyteller. Well, this is just, at some point this struck me as ludicrously vain and misguided. They won't need the storyteller at all. In fact, if you happen to be one of the survivors and you're like, "Hi, I'm the storyteller in this village," they'll be like, "No, we'll use you for, carrying water from the river to the town, since you're not good at anything else, or you can clean up the butcher's workshop. You can sluice the blood out of the barn after they kill the pig." So the book is sort of predicated partly on like, what would someone who had this vanity actually end up doing in a self-sustaining community in a post-technological collapsed society. And that's where my main character comes from. And here's where you start to verge on spoilers, but I'll try to set it up so it's like exciting and makes you want to read the book, right? Something happens where the past kind of comes back. One giant chunk of technology and all the crap of the world that's passed away returns, and it happens to be in the form of the main character's former best friend and nemesis and boss, who's this Hollywood producer. He's like a big blowhard from Hollywood who has the last surviving machine that drives. It's like a one-of-a-kind survivalist supercar that drives across the country, and he shows up in his town in Maine and he says, "I'm here. Here we go. Let's get started again. Let's make a movie or do something else." And the main character has to deal with, being in a way, the go-between between this new agrarian society, this very mellow, collapsed, bucolic, pastoral environment, and the roaring garbage of the past coming back into their space. And part of that is storytelling itself. Like one of the things that this book is interested in, I think, is, what if along with capitalism and ideology and technology and distraction, what if stories themselves are part of the problem? And it would be like better if we just like didn't have them. What if it was like a relief? It's not only, we don't want to hear your story by the fire, we'd rather have you do some menial task for us. It's like, don't start that stuff again. We don't want the stories.
Well, Johnathan, that was one of my questions I was going to ask later, but let's just jump into it now. That I just found that was like one of the interesting aspects of the work. I mean, if somebody had said this is going to be a book about a kind of bucolic soft apocalypse, and maybe there's a little bit of a kind of rosier view than the normal dystopia, I would have said, oh, okay, like maybe we would be better off without technology. But it would never have occurred to me before this book to say we'd be better off without stories. And I just kind of I want you to just like dig a little deeper, like,
yeah,
what is that? What is that about?
Well, obviously, I can't mean it simply or all the way, because I'm made of stories. I mean, this is like my life. So it's a prime example of something that I compulsively do, which is take the things that are most central or precious to me and put them under the pressure of opposition. What if they're actually a catastrophe, or everything I assume is wrong? And I mean, I believe in stories in the sense that having worked as a novelist all my life, but also so I'm immersed in the world of people who value this stuff, including myself, and the transactions that collect around that valuation, like teaching people to tell stories, sharing accounts of books I love, or talking about, like I am with you right now, talking about what I was trying to do when I was writing a story. It's everything to me, right? But I also happen to be interested, and I'm not alone in this, it's a very late 20th century, early 21st century interest in the world of consciousness and neurology. I think after Freudian descriptions of what human experience consisted of began to seem suspect or problematic or limited, the next thing was kind of the Oliver Sacks world of like, what if, or the Daniel Dennett world of thinking about consciousness or neurology as constructing our experience. And so I'm like a customer for thinking about that kind of thing. I'm an amateur. I don't have some revelatory theory about it, but I do feel like, as someone who thinks about stories all the time, when I read and think about what neurology and consciousness does, like how our brains assemble a world out of the sensory data, I think, oh, that is kind of storytelling. Like the selectivity of consciousness, the fact that it's always having to edit and smooth the world into existence for us to make it something we can even maneuver through,
Oh, absolutely.
to not be like just bleeding reaction in response to this overwhelming sensory overload all the time. We have to make stories even just to function, right? So I do see it as really deeply nested into human experience. So I don't really think, for example, that these people in my book who might think of themselves as post-story could possibly be authentically not making narratives of a different kind.
Yeah.
But what they might have put themselves in a kind of gentle opposition to is like grand narratives, mythos, things like, let's say, American exceptionalism, or the frontier imperative, or, growth is good. Like maybe those are stories that could be picked apart. And maybe some other stories like, the great Hollywood genres, the Western or the way science fiction readers have a story that they love, which is that Earth is the cradle and we are meant to like leave it and go into space. these may be stories too that could like use some, like, but you see their live activation all over the place when you see, Elon Musk and the fascination that people have with, oh, we're back, we're back in the game. We're going to launch off this planet. Well, what's that for? What's that story telling us or reassuring us about, or what is it blocking out? What is it keeping us from thinking about?
Well, and another like really interesting thing about storytelling, I want to tie this into Todd Baum. Now, Todd Baum is the kind of main antagonist of the book. He's one of these two guys, and he is the one who drives the supercar, which I love. I love the supercar. Love the supercar. It's a great aspect of the book. But so I want to kind of pivot into his character with this storytelling thing. So I think that like his character is sort of like an American archetype. I think this kind of the kind of charismatic, Yankee peddler who is like, like someone like Vito Corleone, Jay Gatsby. It like Citizen Kane. I know you, for example, have talked about Orson Welles' work and the kind of the complicity that can develop beneath a very charismatic, persuasive man. And I think like one of the key powers that Todd Baum has in this story is the power to wield story. So, I feel like on the one hand, I see what you're saying about storytelling, but at the same time, like a key aspect of what Todd Baum represents and a key aspect of his power and charisma is storytelling, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we could just go on assembling examples, Barnum and Melville's The Confidence Man, and yes, Orson Welles himself, and also the characters he likes to portray, these kind of brilliant, Falstaffian kind of brilliant, manipulative, larger than life figures, and some are more pernicious than others, right? That's the thing, is we do also have an appetite to be amazed and dazzled. The magician or sorcerer, the Prospero figure is very attractive, and one tends to fall in to some kind of association with some version of that in life before you've even identified what's going on. And so the main character in this book, the viewpoint character, Journeyman, is a total he's the archetype of the sidekick, because for every Falstaff there's a Prince Hal. For every Orson Welles or Citizen Kane there's Joseph Cotton. There's the enabler, the sidekick, the wide-eyed guy who's dazzled into involvement in this world.
And Nick Carraway,
absolutely, with Gatsby. And then the question becomes, if the next step is, oh, wait a minute, Falstaff is evil. This is a bad one. Must be contained, must be dealt with. What does the sidekick character, the go-between, the enabler character, learn about themselves at that instant? What do they do? Who are you? Are you the mediating figure? Are you the only one who can conduct the operation of, helping the other people cope with this person because you have access and you have insight? Or is that actually a corrupting thought, and you're actually just the supervillain sidekick? You're part of the problem.
Yeah. And I just have to ask, because it begs the question. A character of just this kind happens to be the president right now. I'm not going to weigh in my official capacity as host of the Thoughtful Bro about the malignancy or non-malignancy of this individual, but regardless, President Trump can tell a story and he can get people on board. Those are two things he is definitely able to do. And I'm just wondering, did he kind of influence this character at all?
I didn't really have to think about Trump to get where I got with this book and this archetype and this character, because the thing about him is he's a generic example, blatant, unmasked, in our faces right now, but not that distinctive. And in a sense, it's funny you say he's a storyteller. He's also a writer on stories. He's like a guy who climbed into the supercar. And then it was like, whoa, how do you operate this thing? And it took off, right? He's a passenger in a horrendous story that he is not, actually necessarily in command of.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I had a question for you just about genre. This is a question that you always get asked. You always get asked about genre because you're always kind of so conscious of genre and blending genres. And I just, like, for the record, I mean, it just seems like you were one of the very first people. I mean, this is so kind of like in vogue right now, this kind of literary genre mashup, and you were one of the first ones to that party way back. And so what I'm wondering about post-apocalyptic is that, you know, the kind of default setting is dystopian, but I see in other genres, there's sometimes, when the default setting is so strong, there's opportunities for others to kind of sneak in with a different kind of approach. And I think, for example, in like high fantasy with Tolkien, it's so somber and solemn. So that makes room for someone like a Terry Pratchett who's doing comedy. You know, in superhero, it's so kind of noble and serious. That makes room for like a Deadpool. But I'm just wondering, did you kind of consciously, and it could be that the answer is just no, but I mean, did you kind of look out at, you know, post-apocalyptic types of stories and think like, boy, like there's nothing out there that is like as witty or funny or literary as what I'm about to do?
Well, okay. So
that's my judgment.
I'm gonna have to wrangle with your all the assertions embedded in that great question, wonderful question. So the first thing is, of course, I wasn't the first to any party. I was the beneficiary of extraordinary work that was done in the interstices of genre and the literary. We better put scare quotes around that term. In the immediate foreground for me were writers like Steve Erickson, who had done a decade of incredible work with specifically the texture of post-apocalyptic American landscapes, and surrealistic ones. And that taught me what was possible. But also, I stand on the shoulders of people like J.G. Ballard and Patricia Highsmith and Shirley Jackson and Philip K. Dick. And also, I took as an example that seemed to me very consonant with those others that I just named, international writers like Angela Carter in England and Julio Cortázar from Argentina, but living in Europe, and Stanislaw Lem in Poland, who were these giants of world literature. No one had any reservations about their literariness. There's something about the United States where, because of the existence of the pulp magazines, the use of the fantastic in literature was regarded, when I was growing up, as a kind of it was a stigma of some kind. It was like subliterary rather than just paraliterary or a version of the literary. So I just saw all of this stuff as enabling what I wanted to do. What I did do that was a little different. Well, I mean, then I had this like magic of timing. I think that the ground had been laid in a generation of readers. And I was an example of those readers. I was one of those people who was ready to stop looking at genre divisions as being so strict, or seeing them as stacked in some sort of hierarchy of value, like there's real writing and then there's all this other stuff underneath it. I was an example of the kinds of readers that I would be writing for. I was exhausted with these classifications and the biases that were baked into them. And so I wrote really directly into this. In a way, it was taken by publishers or by librarians or gatekeepers of other kinds as a kind of problem area, like books that don't sit still in one genre. And rather than regarding it as a problem, I saw it as like an occasion or an opportunity. I was like, I'm gonna exactly make that situation happen over and over again. My first novel was half a hard-boiled detective story and half a dystopian science fiction novel. So from the very beginning, I just announced, if you like this problem, here I am. I'm going to be like exemplifying it for you. If you don't like this problem and it makes your brain hurt, you're going to just want to push me out of your reading life and your thoughts. And it worked out for me. It became like to put it in a framework that's not how I really think about anything I do, but in a way it became a brand. I became like that guy who makes this issue unavoidable. makes it prominent in his work. So I just kept smashing different things together, the Western and also the genres, and this is really important, the genres that don't have a classification system in the library, or a separate section in a bookstore or separate bookstores for them. But everyone knows their genres, like the coming of age novel or the academic satire. I mean, you know, you could have like conventions for people who love academic satires. Yeah. There's certainly enough writers who write them, and everyone recognizes what happens in them. Yeah. That's a genre. It's as formal as like a sonnet. You know, it always takes place during one semester, and you always things come to a climax at like the drunken Christmas party where everyone suddenly reveals what they, you know, it's like, we know how this works. So yeah. With As She Climbed Across the Table, I sort of smashed Italo Calvino up with like John Barth and yeah. Don DeLillo doing an academic satire. That was a genre exercise too. And by naming these things and talking about them, it takes away the kind of weird apprehension that people, which mostly they don't have anymore. I mean, I always feel when I talk about this, I'm embarrassed because younger readers, and this is a wonderful thing, they're like, who cares? Yeah. You don't even need to talk about this so much. That's right. Anymore, yeah. You know?
Right. So let's talk about, so just want to stop for a second to say, if you have questions, we've already got a few, just pop them in the chat and we'll get to them. I want to move on to like just talk about craft for a moment. So you teach at Pomona, and you know, you have students coming through all the time. And I'm just wondering, like, you know, for those of us who can't take your class at Pomona, and if you had to like teach your class in like 30 seconds, like, can you just like tell us like high level, give me like the top one or two things that you generally try to encourage in writers, in young writers that you deal with, and the top one or two things that you see that you try to discourage?
Okay, that's impossible. But I'll say a few things. I mean, first of all, we'll just say them very quickly to say that the universal things that anyone starts with is, remember, it's about reading. It's about your own reading life, which you have to nourish and replenish constantly, because fiction making is created by a brain that is steeped in the forms at conscious and semi-conscious and unconscious levels. The forms and structures of fiction have to be loaded in, and you make it by reproducing these formal gestures. That's not to say you're a copyist or that it's fundamentally unoriginal or plagiaristic. It's just to say the language, like any language, like a musical language or the language we're speaking, of reference and structures and grammar, is actually really unavailable by any other method except reading thousands of novels. That's how you make it in your brain. Right. And also trust your reading loves. Trust what your appetite tells you is exciting and interesting. You're going to want to write like the things that you love reading, and trying to do otherwise doesn't really work. Even if some voice in your head is telling you, don't write like that. That's not what my English teacher says is important literature. Forget it. You're only going to have success, and also you're only going to have enjoyment in the practice if you're writing towards the things that you cherish. Right.
Yeah, and by the way, just one other thing that I thought I heard you say in an interview recently, where you said that that there's that old maxim, you know, the truism that you can't teach somebody to write, but you can teach them to revise. Does that sound fair?
Yes, that's great, and that'll be the next and then the last piece of like broad craft advice that I'll give. I can answer more specific craft questions, but this is another thing that I try to impart. Revision is of the essence. I mean, people hear this and they know this, but it's hard to accept it because the writing gesture is so thrilling. When you get to this place where you face the blank page and you made marks on it, they become so precious, so extraordinary. Look at that! I made a manuscript. There's things on that page. It is incredible. It's miraculous every time it happens to me or anyone else. It's also just part of a process. And the next part of that process, and this is where I'm going to circle it right back to the last thing I was saying. Revision is, you know, it's a proactive. It's an activity. It's not a passive thing, but it begins in something so simple that it can be easily overlooked, which is you have to read your own work. Now, this sounds like the dumbest advice of all. Like, what could be easier? Of course, I can read Kafka. I can read, the language poets. Why couldn't I read my own work? I know what I meant. I know what I intended, so it's right there. Do I really even have to? I can just glance at it and remember it. No, you have to actually look at what you committed to the page and take it in like a reader and experience like, oh, I had this intention, but now these sentences came out of my fingertips and they're there. And what are they doing? What do they indicate? What of my intention actually did land on that page and what didn't? And what surprises are there for me? What am I interested in that I didn't realize I was interested in? Because there's a mystery. There's a great mystery if you open yourself to it, to the writing practice, which is you arrive in places you didn't set out to go.
Right.
By writing. You learn things about yourself and about what you care about in language, in other human beings, in storytelling. It's a discovery. And so then you have to actually look, it's like a lawyer, you have to look at the, discovery is the phase where you demand to see all the materials. You have to read them.
And I just totally agree with you. I think it's just one of the trickiest things because you know how you were feeling when you wrote it. But then the question is, does it, when you're in a different mood, does it make you feel that way or a stranger feel that way? And I just think it's so hard to parse that out because your feeling was so strong when you wrote it,
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so again, a couple questions from the audience will come in, but I promised you all that I would get to like a couple like awesome, like strange questions by the end. So one of them is like, I read an interview recently that Jonathan's first book that he fell in love with was this Alice in Wonderland, like 1941 edition. And he has brought this with him and he's going to show us. This is really cool. So go ahead, Jonathan.
The very copy. So it's got a strange embossed floral design and then nice embossed spine. I don't know if you can read it.
Yeah.
And it's falling apart, but it's held up pretty well. This is an edition from 1942. It was my mother's copy of Alice in Wonderland, and it's an odd piece of bookmaking because it claims to be made on cheap wartime paper, and it's pretty thin. There's this disclaimer up at the front. This series of books has been made necessary by the government's wartime regulations that whenever a book is reprinted, less paper must be used in the reprint. I love also the Zeno's paradox possibility that every time they print Alice in Wonderland, it has to use less paper. And so eventually you end up with this like little, oh, this is the only kind they're allowed to make now of Alice in Wonderland. It's really tiny. But actually they made this unbelievably beautiful edition that I actually don't think has been matched for me. I used to be very focused on like looking at rival editions of Alice in Wonderland, and I never found one that was as pretty. The Tenniel drawings, which are just such great drawings. I'm a purist. I don't think it's ever been better illustrated than it was the first time.
And Jonathan, like, what was it? And tell us about what was the circumstance you came across this book, or like it was?
Well, it was on my mother's bookshelf, and I think she read to me from it probably initially, although I don't remember that. I remember going back to it again and again and reading it myself. And so the drawings are lined in red in Alice in Wonderland and in blue in Through the Looking Glass. And I actually I had a preference for Through the Looking Glass. I mean, there are great characters and moments in both, but I liked chess better than cards at that time in my life. I felt that it met some threshold for cerebral seriousness. Like cards were just a game of chance. So I like the chess characters better than I like the card characters. And I was really transfixed by the Red Queen. This illustration, I think almost every one of my books has some Carol reference in it. And in a couple of instances, they're to the Red Queen's race where she runs as hard as she can just to stay in one place and pulls Alice along with her and explains that.
One audience question just came in apropos of this. They wanted to know who the illustrator was.
Oh yeah, so the first illustrator, the one that Lewis Carroll, worked with, was named John Tenniel, or Tenniel. I don't know how it would be pronounced in England at that time, but John Tenniel, and his name is right there.
Okay.
And these are the illustrations that are finally just the right ones for Alice in Wonderland. I think even though it's been brilliantly illustrated by people like Ralph Steadman and others, because Carol commissioned them. So they're organic to it. I'm still fixated on them.
Awesome. All right, look, so I'm going to do one more question for me, then we'll get to the audience question. So I was rereading this fascinating Bob Dylan interview you did from 2006, about 14 years ago. I'm a huge Dylan fan. That's a whole other discussion. But I had like read that interview many times before, actually, but I just reread it for the sake of this. And a couple of things jumped out. One is that like in one point, Bob Dylan is like listing some people who, let me just read this quote. I'm talking about artists with the willpower not to conform to anybody's reality but their own. Patsy Cline and Billy Lee Riley, Plato and Socrates, Whitman and Emerson, Slim Harpo and Donald Trump. Like, so you've got Bob Dylan putting Donald Trump in with Whitman, Emerson, and Plato like 14 years ago about not conforming to anybody's reality. I just thought that was deeply prophetic.
It's pretty weird. And I think, you know, at some point, that quote got isolated and circulated around on.
Oh, it did. Okay.
On Twitter as a kind of an enigma or a prediction of some kind. But one of the things, I mean, I can actually explain it in a pretty prosaic way, and it's something that you can see Dylan doing in a lot of his weirdest quotes. Is he hates hearing himself start to get serious, and he catches himself midway through an utterance and torpedoes it with some random gesture mid, you know, when it's like he's putting a pin in his own balloon the minute he sees it inflating. So he's making this list and he's citing these highbrow names, and then he's like, oh God, listen to me. And so he just sabotages. And there were a number of things he said to me in that encounter that I think had the character of like, he started out making a point and then he didn't like that he sounded like he was making a point. And so he put a curveball in. Oh. And you can see it in other conversations. That you know,
that's so well observed. I totally can see that. You see it in his songs too. He does that. It just is kind of
his preference. It's a funny thing. Yeah, it's true in his songs too. I think that's accurate. He'll make sure that you can't take him seriously or that you can't be but perplexed. And you know, in terms of the interview mode, he's famously thought of as an evasive or provocative interview subject. And there are those great press conferences from the 60s where he's doing nothing but baiting people's incredibly, you know, predictable, drab questions, right? Where do you get your inspiration, or do you regard yourself as a political artist or whatever? He's a genius at taking the piss, as the British would say. But by the time he's in a room with me and, you know, Michael Gilmore or David Gates in the 90s or the 21st century, he doesn't want to be that jerk to this writer who he's kind of handpicked and agreed to sit in a room with, and he's trying to get a good magazine cover story for Newsweek or Rolling Stone out of it. So he's at cross purposes. He's trying to give a good interview. And at the same time, he's that same guy who used to, in 1966, just assassinate every journalist. So he'll start out earnest, and then he's like, oh no, this is everything I tried not to be my entire life. So then he'll just destroy the reply with a you know, in this case, putting Donald Trump's name into that list.
Oh, wow. All right. One last question about that interview. But you had, there was this great part in it where he's saying that like, he doesn't want to play stadiums. It's funny because like I last saw him at the BU hockey arena.
Yeah, he plays stadiums all the time.
But he plays stadiums all the time. But he said, you know, the best room for him is like a kind of intimate kind of cafe type place. And it's like, it's funny, like it reminded me of this Eddie Vedder quote where Eddie is like, at one point he was like playing cafes in Seattle or something. He's like, I realized I didn't have a cafe voice, I had a stadium voice. So Eddie Vedder, he wants the stadium. So here's my question to you that I thought maybe you'd never been asked, which is that like a Johnathan Lethem book, where is the ideal place to consume that? The bathtub, the airport, the library, like what is the ideal environment?
A bathtub with a radio being thrown in and someone saying, catch! No, that's a really funny question. But I mean, I revert when I think about to be sincere, when I think about my books, I revert to the image of myself discovering like a dusty, out of print science fiction novel by some really weird character in the Brooklyn Public Library on Pacific Street and 4th Avenue when I was 12, and being like, does anyone know this exists? Am I allowed to read this? Do people really write like this? And I just think about, kids reading books that are on the grown-up shelves, or that they find in a summer house or in a used bookstore, if those still exist. And the kids are the kind of kids like I was, who go to the used bookstore and look for outre stuff, that it totally defeats the presentism of the publishing reality. It's not about like, this is what everyone should read, this is the new book, like what we're doing right now, but that it's just experienced as a kind of missive from the undertow of reality, like a book that just speaks to you, and you might be the only person on earth who's reading it right now, or maybe who even knows it exists. I often felt that the most incredible connections I made with books were when I was sure I was the only person on earth who was reading it,
That's awesome. What a cool answer. Okay, so look, let's just, we're running out of time almost, but I want to get a couple of these questions. So one of them is, it was apropos of us talking about you subverting expectations. So the question is then, what advice would you give now to somebody who wants to subvert expectations now? Because those expectations are already clearly subverted. So what's the new frontier?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm very uneasy with suggestions, like the idea of the avant-garde. There's a lot of things that have been labeled avant-garde that I love, but the idea that's embedded in the term that there's some sort of frontier or moving line for innovation. Most of the most audacious things I can think to do, if I didn't know the example of someone doing something kind of like that, having that kind of idea before, either formally or in terms of a genre, violation of expectations or whatever. If I didn't know the example already, later on after I wrote and published the thing, someone would say to me, this reminds me of this. I'm like, yep, they got there first. So thinking about it as like you have to break ground or innovate, or it's not a realm of scientific revolutions. It's really more a realm of this incredible, now this accumulation of extraordinarily rich kit of possibilities and materials. I mean, it kind of after modernism, and I mean that like the formal movement called modernism, which is whatever Anglophilic, Eurocentric, and it probably like just like Picasso's faces that turned out to be African masks. There's lots of things that have been dreamed of in other realities and other cultures before modernism ever got to them. But after that toolkit had been sort of acquired and exemplified by the modernists, what I think you have is just freedom to personalize the materials. And that's more innovative a gesture or a choice than any kind of deliberate, radical, formal, like, no one ever thought of this before. I guarantee you someone probably actually will immediately come up to you with an example and be like, you just reproduced what, like, Georges Perec did in 1962. And that's okay. It's really good, because personalizing this, fiction in specific, is what I think about all the time, is just this, I talked about it, the way it mirrors consciousness, the way it's connected to brain circuitry. Right. It's an incredible tool for articulating individual experience and collective experience simultaneously. It says, like, this is what I'm like, and this is what the world is like. Yeah. And what an amazing mess the two make together. Like I'm being and thinking and experiencing all this subjective stuff, and I have to move through this space that we all more or less agree exists, in objective terms, and all these other subjective brains are wandering through it too, and we're all arguing with each other. What a cacophonous situation to try to put into art. And fiction demands that we try, to do both, to do the inside of our heads and the world outside our bodies.
Great. All right. I'm going to throw two questions to you at once. The two last questions we'll take from the audience, and just so you can kind of try to answer them because we're running out of time. But one is, why did it take so long for Motherless Brooklyn to get made? And the other one was, what are you reading right now?
Okay. Well, very quickly, films, I think it's a miracle any film ever gets made, you know, and the number of my books that have been developed to some point and then it attenuated and didn't happen. You know, if you could go to the multiplex in the sky where all the possible movies of my books were playing, you could see like a David Lynch version of Amnesia Moon, and you could see the David Cronenberg version of As She Climbed Across the Table, and you could see the Darren Aronofsky version of Fortress of Solitude. So that Edward Norton got the bloody thing done, whether it took him 20 years or whatever, is just all now, from looking at this process from the inside, it seems incredible that it comes about. But I think he did a lot of other things. He was an actor. You know, it's very easy to be, and he's good at a lot of things, but he's a celebrated actor with an actor's agent, and directors are coming at him with scripts and saying, act in these movies all the time. So even if he felt that he was a director and a writer as well, the world was constantly telling him, be in another movie, be an actor. That's your bread and butter. So it's hard to switch gears. But also, I think he had a lot of work to do because he wanted to mash the book up with his fascination with urbanism. You know, it's not my book. It's half my book or maybe even less. And there's a whole lot of Robert Moses and The Power Broker, and also things Edward knew about and thought about because he came from the family of a famous urban planner. So this was like intimate material for him. That wasn't necessarily an easy nut for him to crack, right?
Yeah. Great. And then how about last question? What about what you're reading now?
What am I reading? Well, I'm reading a lot of my students' work right now because I'm just in the finishing throes of a very intense and good teaching workshop. So I'm more anticipating some of the reading that I'm going to bust out with and get to very shortly. But and I have a terrible tendency to freeze up at this question. Partly you get confused because I'm a very well, we'll call it generous. Some people would call it like promiscuous blurber. So I get sent a lot of galleys and manuscripts. I read a lot of books that aren't published yet, and then I forget, and maybe I don't even know that they've been published eventually. And so sometimes I end up mentioning things to people that I'm excited about, and I realize, oh, that was just a manuscript. But in this year, I can tell you, I was knocked out by new books by both, just to give you a few new things, even though I'm the enemy of presentism and promotion in the publishing world. I'll give you some new things you can run out and buy.
Yeah.
Lydia Millet's newest novel is incredible. I really loved the Rumaan Alam book, and I loved it was early in the year, the Emily St. John Mandel was, I think I like The Glass Hotel even better than Station 11. You can see me kind of peering, trying to look at this bookshelf here and see what I can spot and remind myself of. Those are a couple of things that are new and published, as opposed to still galleys. So
all right, cool. Well, look, we're gonna wrap, but I have one more question that I always ask everybody. Okay, so first of all, I think I forgot. Do you have a copy of the book that you can hold up, The Arrest?
It's sitting right here. Yeah,
just make an impulse buy. Just keep hitting the buy now, even if you've already bought it. Just hit it again.
You can just tap the screen where my book is, and it'll be in your house in like 5 seconds. Just touch right here.
Okay, so here's my last question. So for The Arrest, imagine that you have the ideal reader for this book. Every joke you're making, every allusion, everything about this book is working for them just the way that you intended. And they get to the end of the book and they close the book. Just describe for me, in a phrase or a word, what is the feeling that this ideal reader would have finishing The Arrest?
Oh God, that's challenging. The feeling they would have. Well, I'll say they should feel like I'd better read all of the books that the author mentioned in the course of the book. because that was so cool. And if it depended upon all of those sources, then they must be also things I should read.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Johnathan. This has been so great. I really appreciate you taking the time. The book, guys, is amazing. We didn't even get into kind of like how beautiful the language is and how funny it is. And just, I mean, if you had done a reading, you might have gotten a taste of that, but just buy the book. It's just so beautifully written. Thank you for being on the show, Johnathan. And folks, we'll see you all next week.
Thanks so much.